Story number 1. The Crossing. The town had always been a quiet place, nestled between the hills and the river, its people simple and content. At the edge of town stood an old bridge, its wooden planks worn by time and the weather. The townsfolk didn't talk about it much, but everyone knew. No one crossed it after dark. The town had a rhythm, a kind of unspoken rule, and crossing that bridge when the sun dipped low was something best left alone. Maggie, the newcomer, had only been in town a few weeks, but she had already started to notice the way people avoided the bridge. It wasn't mentioned directly, but there were subtle cues. Soft whispers when the subject came up, a change in the conversation if someone dared mention it in public. There was something unsettling about it, something that clung to the air like a cold mist. Maggie was used to mysteries. She'd encountered plenty in her time, but this one was different. It was wrapped in silence, as though speaking too much would somehow make it worse. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch of the small diner where she worked, Maggie asked the elderly woman who often sat at the far corner, knitting quietly, about the bridge. "I noticed people avoid it after sunset," Maggie said, her voice casual but filled with curiosity. "Why is that?" The old woman, Mrs. Blackwell, paused her knitting, her gnarled hands still. She looked up at Maggie, eyes clouded with memories, and let out a long, slow breath. It wasn't the kind of sigh one made from weariness. It was heavier, full of something darker. "You're not from here, are you?" Mrs. Blackwell asked, her voice like gravel scraping across stone. Maggie shook her head. "I'm from the city, just moved here recently." Mrs. Blackwell looked back down at her knitting, her fingers moving absently as she began to speak. "People don't cross that bridge at night because it changes them. Not all at once, mind you, it's slow. But if you're foolish enough to cross, you'll feel it. Something pulls at you, and then, after a while, you're not quite the same anymore." Maggie furrowed her brow. "What do you mean, like a superstition?" Mrs. Blackwell shook her head, her thin lips pressed tight. "No, child, it's not like that. It started with accidents, strange ones. First, a man fell from the bridge one night. No reason, no sign that anything was wrong. Just slipped and fell. That's how it always begins. Something small. Then people started seeing things. Shadows, shapes, moving around them. But no one ever said anything aloud. They didn't want to seem foolish." Maggie leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. "What happened to the people who crossed?" "The accidents kept happening," Mrs. Blackwell said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of old memories. "But it wasn't just the fallings. People started changing, not physically, not at first, but you could tell. Their eyes would go distant, like they were somewhere else, and their actions, small things at first, would grow odd. A farmer would forget his tools at the field. A woman would sit in her home for hours without moving. A child would stop playing, staring out the window, just staring, waiting for something." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "And then what happened?" "They'd vanish," Mrs. Blackwell said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some of them never came back. And those who did weren't the same, not fully. They'd act like themselves, but something would be off. The way they spoke, the way they looked at you, like they were listening to something just beyond your reach." Maggie's skin crawled. She had heard of places like this, the kinds of towns where people avoided certain areas, not because of superstition, but because something real, something tangible and terrifying waited there. She leaned back in her chair, the afternoon sunlight suddenly feeling colder. "So, no one crosses the bridge at night anymore?" "Not if they know what's good for them," Mrs. Blackwell replied, her voice hardening with a trace of something ancient and bitter. But there are always those who think they can handle it. They go across, and then something happens. The town's never quite the same after that. Maggie glanced over at the bridge, which stood in the distance, dark and silent. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows across the water. The air felt thick, almost as though it were alive, pressing in from every side. She shivered despite herself. Mrs. Blackwell was still knitting, her hands steady. Whatever is on that bridge, it's not just in your head, it takes something from you, something no one can ever get back. Maggie's mind raced, but before she could speak, the old woman's voice cut through her thoughts. Just don't go after dark. Trust me, child, it's not worth it. Maggie didn't ask any more questions that day. She sat quietly, staring at the bridge. The sun was setting now, casting a dark shadow over the wooden planks that stretched across the river. The town felt smaller, and she felt a tugging at her heart. A pull, subtle but insistent, like an invitation. But she didn't move, and she didn't cross. Not that night. And, from then on, Maggie knew there would always be a part of the town that would never quite be hers. Something in the air, in the whispers, and in the way the bridge stood, dark and untouched after dark. Some things, she realized, were better left unexplored. The crossing would remain forever, a mystery that would only be solved by those who were brave or foolish enough to cross. And they would never be the same again. Story number 2. The Silent Witness. The road trip had been a spontaneous decision, made in the kind of heat that melted the air around them. They had been driving for hours, their conversations winding through light jokes and tired silences, until the scenery began to blur. The highway stretched on in front of them, long and quiet, until they reached the bridge. It was an old thing, an ancient stone arch that spanned a creek with a languid, twisting current. It was the kind of place you didn't notice until you were already too close. The air had a thick, humid quality to it, as if the day itself was stuck in a haze. The bridge seemed to almost beckon, its weight pressing down on the ground beneath it. "Let's stop here," Jason said, his voice a little too eager after hours of silence. They parked by the bridge, the sound of tires on gravel breaking the stillness. The 4 of them, Jason, Claire, Lara, and Sam, stepped out of the car, stretching, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in uneven patches. "Do you think anyone still uses it?" Lara asked, eyeing the bridge with an unease she couldn't quite explain. "Who knows?" Claire said. "It looks like no one's crossed in years." They approached the edge, and Jason, always the curious one, leaned over the railing. The water below was dark, deep with the kind of murky surface that suggested it hid secrets too old to be uncovered. "You're not really going to jump, are you?" Sam asked, grinning. Jason ignored him, his eyes fixed on something beneath the bridge. There was a heaviness in the air now, a quiet hum that didn't belong. Something was off. The peacefulness, the stillness, it didn't feel right. The kind of quiet that made you wait for the moment the world would break, just a crack in the calm. He took another step, leaning even farther over the edge, straining to see what lay in the shadows beneath the stone. "Hey, come on, you're freaking us out," Lara said. But there was something about her voice that didn't sound entirely joking. Jason blinked, feeling a sudden rush of dizziness. It was as though the ground beneath his feet had suddenly tilted, and for a moment the world seemed to fold in on itself. The sound of the water seemed to fade into a dull hum, the air growing colder. A sickening sense of disorientation swept through him. Before he could speak, his eyes lifted to the far side of the bridge. That's when he saw it. A figure. It stood in the far distance, just beyond the last stone arch where the trees met the field. The figure was cloaked, a dark shape that blended with the evening light. At first, Jason thought it might be a trick of the shadows, the fading light playing games with his mind. But no, the figure was too still, too deliberate. It wasn't just standing, it was watching. And it was silent. The silence was the worst part. Everything around them seemed to hold its breath. Jason tried to move, to say something, but his words felt trapped in his chest. He turned to the others, his face pale. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Claire followed his gaze, and her expression tightened. Sam stepped closer, his eyes scanning the distance. Lara didn't say anything, but her hand gripped her purse a little tighter. "What is it?" Sam finally asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Jason said. I thought it was a person, but..." His voice trailed off. They all looked back at the cloaked figure, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had frozen. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. It was as though it was waiting, just as they were. "We should go," Lara said, her voice tight. "Now." But Jason didn't want to look away. He couldn't. It was like the figure was drawing him in, pulling him deeper into something he couldn't understand. It had to be watching them. Had it been watching them the whole time? He felt the heavy weight of that thought, a creeping, sick realization that something had been observing them long before they even arrived. And then, just as suddenly as the sensation had hit him, the disorientation faded, and the world snapped back into focus. The figure was gone. "Where did it go?" Claire asked, her voice shaking. "There was someone there, right?" I don't know," Jason said, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. "It was just there." I swear, the four of them stood there in silence for a long moment, the shadows growing longer as the day passed its tipping point into dusk. The air felt colder now, and the sound of the creek was no longer a comfort. It was just noise, like the world had shifted in some subtle way. "We need to leave," Lara said, her voice steady now, though her hand was trembling slightly as she reached for Jason's arm. They turned quickly, walking back to the car, not looking back at the bridge, though every step felt heavy, as though they were being followed by something they couldn't see. As they drove away, the bridge fading into the rearview mirror, none of them spoke. But they all knew, in the silence that stretched between them, that they hadn't been alone on that bridge. And whatever had been watching them, it had seen them more clearly than they could ever understand. Story number 3. The Night Watcher. Every evening, as the sun began to dip behind the hills and the shadows lengthened across the town, a man would appear near the old bridge. It was always the same time, just as twilight began to settle, when the world was caught in that brief, quiet moment between day and night. He stood there, unmoving, staring down at the slow-moving river below. The townspeople were used to him. No one spoke of it much, but they all knew he would be there, a silhouette against the fading light. To the people of the town, he was just another oddity, a fixture of the landscape, like the bridge itself or the old oak tree by the school. No one questioned his presence, it was simply accepted. And so, the years went by, and the man stood there every evening in silence as the day slipped away. But one evening, a visitor arrived. She had come to the town to visit her aunt, who had lived there all her life. It was a quiet, sleepy place, and the visitor had never been particularly interested in its details, but this time something caught her eye. As she walked into town, she noticed the man standing by the bridge. His presence was impossible to ignore. He didn't seem to belong in the town. His clothes were too old, his posture too still. There was something unsettling about him, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Curiosity got the better of her, and as the man remained motionless, staring at the water, she approached him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tentative. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. He didn't even turn to look at her, his gaze fixed on the river below. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice low and hollow, as if it had not been used in a long time. "I've been waiting," he said, "for a long time now." The visitor frowned. Waiting for whom? The man's gaze didn't leave the water. "For someone," he replied, his voice almost a whisper, as if the words had to be spoken very carefully. "Someone who will cross the bridge again, as they always do." The visitor's eyes narrowed. "Who? There's no one here but you." The man shook his head slowly. "They've been gone for years, but they'll come back. They always do. They cross the bridge at twilight like clockwork. I've been waiting for them, waiting for a very long time." The visitor felt a cold shiver creep down her spine. The air around her had become heavier, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened with the man's words. She glanced back at the bridge, but there was nothing unusual about it. It seemed like any other bridge, weathered by time, surrounded by the fading light of evening. "Who is it you're waiting for?" she asked, her voice now trembling slightly. The man paused, and for the first time, he turned his eyes toward her. There was nothing in them, just emptiness, an endless depth. It was as if he could see through her, or perhaps had stopped seeing altogether. "They'll come," he said again, his voice distant. "They always do. And when they do, they'll cross the bridge, and I'll be here, waiting for them. I'm the only one who waits." The visitor took a step back, unsure of what to make of his words. She looked at him again, a strange feeling creeping over her, a sense that something wasn't quite right. But before she could ask more questions, the man turned back to the river, his attention drawn once again to the water below. With one last glance, the visitor turned away and hurried back to her aunt's house. She didn't look back. That night, the town was quiet, as it always was. The visitor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the encounter. Who was the man? And who was the person he was waiting for? The next evening, she decided to walk to the bridge again. But when she arrived, the man was gone. The bridge stood empty, the river flowing steadily beneath it. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it all, but the unease in her chest told her otherwise. She asked around the town the next day, but no one seemed surprised when she mentioned the man by the bridge. They all knew him, they said. He was just the man who waited. But no one could say for sure who he was waiting for, or why. Days turned into weeks, and the visitor stayed in the town, but the man never returned. No one spoke of him, and life moved on, as it always did. But every evening, when the light began to fade, the visitor would glance toward the bridge, as though expecting to see him again. And sometimes, just for a moment, she would swear she could feel his presence, waiting, silent, unmoving, at the edge of her vision, just beyond the river, where the twilight met the dark. Story number 4, The Forgotten Toll. The family had been traveling for hours, the long stretch of highway unfolding before them like a ribbon leading into nowhere. It was the kind of road trip that promised nothing more than quiet landscapes and the hum of tires on asphalt. They had left the city behind, the bustling noise fading into the past as they made their way through sleepy towns. The kind of places you passed through but never really saw. When they reached the town, it seemed no different from the others. A few scattered houses, a dusty gas station with peeling paint, and a diner that had probably seen better days. They weren't in any hurry. They had planned to stretch their legs, grab a bite, maybe take a quick break before continuing their journey. But then they saw the bridge. It wasn't part of the map. It wasn't something they had noticed on their way in. The family had been so focused on getting to their destination, they hadn't paid much attention to the roads, but this bridge seemed out of place. It stood at the edge of town, old and weathered, with stone arches that looked too heavy for the river below. It was one of those structures that looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even centuries, its presence unmarked and forgotten by time. "Didn't see this on the way in," Rachel, the mother, said, her voice unsure as she glanced at the bridge. "Maybe it's new," said Mark, her husband, though he didn't sound convinced. He turned the car toward the bridge anyway, curiosity pulling them forward. They slowed as they approached the toll booth at the far end of the bridge. It was a strange little structure, made of crumbling stone and old wood, with a window that was mostly obscured by grime. The booth was empty, the small square opening dark and silent. There was no sign of anyone working, no indication that the toll had ever been collected. "Should we stop?" Rachel asked, though the question was more of a formality than anything. They didn't want to get into any trouble. Mark frowned. "It doesn't look like anyone's here. I guess we just cross?" They hesitated for a moment longer, but the pull of the bridge was too strong. The desire to continue onward too great. Without another word, Mark eased the car forward, the tires rolling across the old wooden planks of the bridge. The river below rippled quietly, as if unaware of the moment that was unfolding above it. As they crossed, something seemed to change in the air. The atmosphere had thickened, the light around them feeling heavier, darker. It was as if the air had become saturated with something unseen, something old and waiting. The family felt it, though none of them spoke of it at first. It was as if something had shifted beneath their feet, something they couldn't quite grasp. When they reached the other side, the world felt different. The car was quieter than it had been before, and the road ahead seemed longer. Rachel looked out the window, but the town they had just passed through was no longer visible. The trees on either side of the road looked unfamiliar, their branches twisting in a way that unsettled her. The light, too, seemed wrong. It was as if the sky had faded to a dull gray, no longer bathed in the warm colors of the late afternoon sun. "I don't remember it looking like this," Mark said, glancing at the road ahead. His voice sounded distant, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Rachel frowned. "It's just a different part of town. We're fine." But something gnawed at the back of her mind, a whisper of doubt that she couldn't shake. Something about the bridge. Something about the toll. It wasn't until later, much later, that they began to realize what had happened. At first, it was small things, details that didn't quite add up. Mark found that he couldn't remember certain conversations they'd had during the drive, moments that should have been clear in his mind but were now hazy, like fog over a distant memory. Rachel's reflection in the rearview mirror seemed too still, as if she wasn't really there, but just a shadow of herself. Then came the dreams. Rachel dreamt of the bridge. In her dreams, she would always find herself standing alone in the toll booth, staring out at the empty road. The air would be thick, oppressive, and there would be a sense of waiting for something she could never quite reach. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the memory of the dream lingering like a weight on her chest. Mark didn't speak of it, but he had the same dreams, and the same strange feeling that something was missing. The more he tried to remember, the less clear everything became, as if pieces of himself had been taken, little by little, without his realizing it. It was Rachel who finally put it all together. One evening, sitting alone in the kitchen, she glanced down at her hands. Her fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from a deeper, emptier sensation. It was then that she realized what had happened. They hadn't paid the toll. Not with money, not with anything material. They had crossed the bridge, and in doing so, they had left something behind. A piece of themselves. Something they didn't fully understand until now. And they would never get it back. They hadn't paid the toll with coins or with a ticket. They had paid it with something far more valuable. Something they would feel the absence of for the rest of their lives. And as they drove away, with the bridge disappearing behind them, the weight of what they had lost settled over them, thick and heavy, like the air that had surrounded the toll booth. There was no turning back now. The forgotten debt had been paid, and it would change them forever. Story number 5. The Other Side. Margaret had crossed the old bridge more times than she could count. It was part of her routine, a simple path that led her home after another long day at work. The bridge, with its worn stones and the faint scent of moss that lingered in the air, had always felt familiar to her, almost comforting in a way. She knew every crack in the pavement, every curve in the road leading up to it. It was just another part of her world. But today, something was different. As she stepped onto the bridge, Margaret noticed it immediately. The air was heavier, thick in a way she couldn't quite explain. The sound of the river flowing below seemed muffled, as though it were underwater. She shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe she was just tired. It had been a long week, and the weather had been dreary. Everything seemed off when the clouds hung so low. She crossed the bridge as usual, her footsteps echoing against the ancient stones. But as she reached the other side, something caught her eye. The town she had known for years, the town she lived in, looked different. At first, it was small things. The streets were emptier than they usually were. The houses seemed quieter, as though no one was inside. But it was more than that. There was something about the air, something in the way the light fell across the buildings. The world felt unfamiliar, like she was seeing it through a fog. Margaret stopped frowning. She glanced around. The streets, the buildings, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel right. The people walking by didn't seem to notice her confusion. They went about their business, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. No one looked up at her. It was as if they were all just going through the motions of their lives, unaware of anything different. She shook the feeling off and started walking. Maybe she was just imagining things, she thought. It was all too easy to get lost in your own mind when you were tired. She turned the corner, heading down the street that led to her apartment, but then she stopped again. There was a woman standing at the end of the block watching her. She wasn't standing like the others, moving quickly past her without a glance. No, this woman was standing perfectly still, her arms folded, her gaze locked on Margaret with an intensity that felt strange, almost too knowing. Margaret paused, her heart suddenly racing. She knew this woman. Or, at least she should have. She had seen her before in passing, in the grocery store or on the sidewalk. But this time, there was something in her eyes that made Margaret uneasy. It was like the woman was waiting for her, waiting for something. Margaret continued walking, but the woman didn't move. And when she reached the end of the street, Margaret glanced back, half expecting the woman to have disappeared into the crowd. But no, she was still there, watching. Her stomach churned. This wasn't right. This wasn't her town, it wasn't her world. She quickened her pace, turning down a different street, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The buildings seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The people around her seemed to blur, like figures in a dream that she couldn't quite focus on. Her thoughts started to race, and the feeling in her chest grew heavier, like something pressing down on her. She passed a store she recognized, but it looked different. The windows were dusty, and the sign had faded, the letters barely visible. She had shopped there before, but it didn't seem like the same place. Margaret's heart started to pound. She needed to get home. She needed to see something that felt familiar, something that would anchor her back to the reality she knew. But as she turned another corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her apartment building was ahead of her, but it wasn't the same. It looked run down now, the paint peeling off the walls, the windows cracked. She had lived there for years, and yet she didn't recognize it anymore. The door to the building was ajar, as if it had been forgotten, left to decay. No, this couldn't be happening. It was all wrong. The people, the streets, the buildings, nothing was right. Margaret stumbled back, her breath coming faster. She needed to get back to the bridge, to the place she knew, to the path she had walked 100 times. She turned and ran, her legs moving without thinking, as if the bridge would offer some kind of escape, some way to return to the world she recognized. When she reached the bridge, it was just as she had left it, old, quiet, and worn by time. She stopped at the edge, gasping for breath, and looked across the river, hoping that if she crossed back, everything would be as it had been. But when she stepped back onto the bridge, something strange happened. The world behind her, her town, her life, faded away, and when she looked forward, she saw something new. A different street, a different set of houses, a different set of people. Margaret stopped in the middle of the bridge, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know which way to go. She didn't know what world she was in anymore. And for the first time, she realized the truth. She wasn't just walking through a town that had changed. She was walking through a world that wasn't hers. A world that was never hers. The bridge, the one she had crossed so many times before, had taken her somewhere else. Somewhere she couldn't return from. And she wasn't sure if she wanted to anymore. The bridge-keeper's warning. It was a night thick with fog, the kind that clung to the ground and twisted around the trees like a living thing. The road stretched on ahead, barely visible through the haze. Thomas, a traveler passing through a quiet, forgotten town, had been driving for hours, his headlights cutting through the gloom in long, lonely sweeps. His stomach ached for rest, but there was no sign of a place to stop. He had been driving in circles for what felt like hours, and the fog wasn't helping. Eventually, he saw it. An old bridge, barely more than a shadow looming ahead, its arches barely visible in the dense mist. The road leading to it was narrow, and the bridge itself looked like something out of a story, ancient and forgotten. A strange feeling settled in his chest, a hint of unease, but he pressed on, hoping it would lead him out of the fog. As he approached the bridge, he saw an old man standing near the edge, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. The man's clothes were old-fashioned, the fabric of his coat worn thin and patched in places. He looked as though he had been standing there for a long time. The soft yellow glow of Thomas's headlights shone on the man, but he didn't react, just stared into the fog. Thomas slowed the car and rolled down the window, curious. "Excuse me," he called, his voice breaking the silence. "Is this the way through to the next town?" The old man's head turned slowly, his eyes not focusing on Thomas's face but somewhere just beyond him, as if he were looking through him. He didn't speak immediately. The air was thick with the sound of the distant river flowing beneath the bridge, but there was something about the silence that made Thomas uneasy. "You're not from around here," the old man said, his voice raspy, like he had forgotten how to speak properly. "You shouldn't be crossing this bridge." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "I've been driving for hours. I need to get through." The old man's lips curled into a strange smile. "The bridge is cursed," he said slowly, as if savoring the words. "Once you cross, you'll never truly return. You'll think you're going home, but you'll be lost. Lost in ways you can't understand. The fog knows. It'll follow you." Thomas chuckled, his nerves fluttering with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "A cursed bridge? Come on, old man, it's just a bridge. I've crossed plenty of them in my time." He paused, watching the man's serious face. "You're just trying to scare me, aren't you?" The old man didn't answer. He simply shook his head, his eyes dark under the brim of his hat. "You laugh now, but you'll understand soon enough. This place, it's not what it seems. Once you cross, something changes. It changes you." Thomas rolled his eyes, shaking his head in amusement. "All right, I've heard enough of this." He gave a polite nod and started the engine, ignoring the old man's warning as he drove onto the bridge. As he crossed, the world seemed to shift slightly, but he didn't think much of it. The fog wrapped around his car like a blanket, and the only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the distant rush of the water below. But as soon as he reached the other side, something felt different. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it gnawed at him. The trees along the road looked unfamiliar. The houses that had seemed so ordinary a moment ago now seemed strangely distant, as if they weren't quite real. The streetlights flickered in odd intervals, casting long, unnatural shadows. He glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bridge behind him, but it was gone, swallowed by the fog. Thomas slowed the car, frowning. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The road ahead stretched on, but it was nothing like he remembered. The landscape had shifted subtly, like a dream that had begun to slip away. He passed a small shop that he was sure hadn't been there before. The windows were covered in grime, the sign barely visible. It looked abandoned, like something out of a forgotten time. But the lights were on inside. As he drove by, he noticed someone moving in the shadows behind the windows. A figure, but it wasn't clear enough to make out who. Thomas sped up, trying to shake the unease creeping along his spine. Maybe it was just his imagination. But then, as he reached a familiar intersection, he saw something else. The faces of people walking along the sidewalk. They looked familiar, but not quite right. Their movements were too stiff, their gazes too vacant. They didn't acknowledge him as he drove past, but their eyes seemed to follow him, just out of the corner of his vision. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every mile. The fog never lifted, and now it felt like it was closing in on him, wrapping around him in a way that made him feel like he was suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest, and he glanced at the rearview mirror again. For a split second, he thought he saw the bridge again, standing far behind him, hidden in the fog. But when he blinked, it was gone. "What the hell is going on?" Thomas whispered to himself. The air in the car grew colder, and he swore he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, faint and distant, but unmistakable. He slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the car faster, but the feeling of being pursued remained. It wasn't until hours later, when he finally found a place to pull over, that the full weight of what had happened began to hit him. He looked around. Everything was wrong. The faces in the windows, the cars parked along the street, the lights that flickered but never fully illuminated anything. It was all wrong. The town had changed. It had shifted. And the fog? It hadn't dissipated. Thomas closed his eyes, his heart racing. The old man's warning echoed in his mind. Once you cross, you'll never truly return. And now, he realized, it wasn't just the town that had changed, it was him. Story number 7. The echoing footsteps. The old stone bridge had always been a place of whispers. No one really talked about it. but the children of the town all knew the rumors. It was said that anyone who crossed the bridge alone would hear footsteps following them, footsteps that weren't their own. At least, that's what the older kids said. They spoke of the bridge with a certain gravity, as if it was a place they'd only visit in passing, never lingering too long. But for Sarah, Mark, Ellie, and Tom, the bridge was just another challenge, another place to dare each other to go. They'd heard the stories, sure, but what was a little superstition between friends? The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the small clearing by the bridge, and the air felt heavier than usual. The children stood at the edge, peering across the weathered stones that stretched over the quiet creek. "I bet I can do it," Sarah said, her voice full of that confident edge that came with being the oldest. "You'll hear the footsteps," Mark warned, a grin on his face. He leaned against the old oak tree, arms crossed. "Just like the stories say." Sarah wasn't afraid. "I'll be fine. I'll make it to the other side, and I won't even hear them." She set her jaw and took a step forward, determined to prove her friends wrong. The others watched in silence as she crossed the bridge, her footsteps echoing faintly against the old stones. At first, there was nothing. The only sound was the creaking of the old bridge as she stepped carefully over the worn planks. But then, just as she reached the halfway point, she heard something. A soft, faint tapping, as if someone were walking just behind her. She paused. The footsteps stopped too. Sarah's breath quickened and she turned around. The bridge stretched behind her, empty, silent. No one was there. "Just the wind," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the unease that crept up her spine. She took another step, and then there it was again. A soft, deliberate step behind her. Her heart raced, but she didn't look back this time. She forced herself to keep walking faster now, the sound of her own footsteps louder in her ears. She reached the far side of the bridge and didn't stop until she was standing on solid ground. Her friends were waiting for her, watching with wide eyes. "Well?" Tom asked, half laughing, half concerned. Sarah didn't say anything. She just nodded, trying to appear calm. "It's nothing," she said, though her voice sounded strained. But then it was Mark's turn. The dare had been set, and now he had to follow through. He squared his shoulders, determined not to be outdone. "I'll show you," he muttered, stepping onto the bridge. The others stayed back, watching in silence as Mark began his walk across. The air was still, almost too still, the fog gathering thicker around the edges of the clearing. At first, it seemed like nothing would happen, but soon enough the same thing began. The soft, rhythmic footsteps just behind him, following every step he took. He stopped. The footsteps stopped. Mark spun around, his eyes wide, but the bridge was empty as it had been when he first stepped onto it. There was nothing but the thick fog swirling around the old stones. "What the hell?" Mark whispered to himself, his voice shaking now. He started walking faster, almost running, but the footsteps followed, each one louder than the last. "Mark!" Ellie called, but he didn't hear her. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he barely registered the cold sweat on his skin as he rushed to the end of the bridge. His feet hit solid ground with a jolt, and he skidded to a stop, gasping for air. "Did you hear them?" he asked, his voice hoarse, but his friends just stared at him, confused. "You're fine," Sarah said, a little too quickly. "It's just the wind." But Mark didn't think it was the wind. He knew what he'd heard. It was Ellie's turn next, and she hesitated before stepping onto the bridge. "I don't know," she said, glancing back at the others. "I think we should go home." But the others encouraged her, the challenge still hanging in the air, so Ellie stepped forward, her footfall light against the stone. The same eerie silence fell over the bridge, but soon enough, Ellie, too, heard the footsteps. At first, they were soft, just like the others had heard. She looked back, her heart racing, but the bridge remained empty. Her breath caught. She started walking faster, but the footsteps followed. Louder now, the sound of heavy boots hitting the stone behind her. Ellie turned again, but there was no one there. "Ellie, come on!" Tom shouted from the other side, but Ellie couldn't speak. Her legs moved faster, her mind in a frenzy as the footsteps grew nearer, closer, until she was nearly running. And then, as she reached the end of the bridge, she stopped. A shadow stood there, watching her from the far side. It wasn't a person, not really. It was tall and dark, just a shape against the mist, its edges indistinct, shifting like smoke. It didn't move, just stared, and Ellie's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't move. The footsteps behind her were gone now, replaced by a silence that seemed to press against her ears. The shadow, silent and still, watched her. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Just a flicker in the fog. Ellie didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran off the bridge, her feet pounding against the earth as she joined the others, her body trembling uncontrollably. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We need to leave right now." None of them spoke as they walked away, the fog thick and heavy around them. But the footsteps, they followed, echoing behind them as they walked home, a sound that never quite faded away. Story number 8. The Bridge to Nowhere. Laura had driven across the old bridge countless times. It was the quickest route home, a shortcut that led her down a quiet road, past the familiar streets of the town. The bridge was always there, its wooden planks creaking under the weight of her car, the river flowing beneath, hidden by the thick trees on either side. It wasn't much to look at, just an old, forgotten bridge that seemed to blend into the landscape, but it had always been there, or so she thought. On this particular evening, the air was heavy with the kind of oppressive stillness that only late afternoons in early fall could bring. The sun hung low, casting a golden light over the fields she passed. Laura had just finished a long day at work, her mind wandering to the mundane tasks that awaited her at home. She drove with the windows down, the cool breeze sweeping in, offering a small relief to the day's weariness. As she crossed the bridge, the familiar creak of the wood under the tires was the only sound she could hear. The road was quiet, and the trees seemed to bow under the weight of the evening fog rolling in from the river. She didn't think much of it at the time, but when she reached the far end of the bridge, something felt off. The road ahead was the same, empty, stretching out into the evening. But when Laura glanced in her rearview mirror, the bridge was gone. There was no sign of it, no hint of the familiar wooden structure or the small stone pillars that lined its edges. The fog had thickened, and in its grip, the bridge had vanished. She slammed on the brakes, her heart racing. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, and she looked again, but the bridge was still gone. There was nothing behind her but a long stretch of empty road. Panic set in. Laura turned the car around, hoping she had just missed it, but when she looked again, the bridge was simply not there. Her mind was spinning. She had crossed that bridge not 5 minutes ago. She was certain of it. She even remembered the way the tires had hummed over the wood, the slight dip in the middle where the bridge sagged. It had to be there, but it wasn't. Laura's breath quickened, and she sped back down the road, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the bridge. It was as though it had been erased from the world. The fog clung to the edges of the road, making the landscape look distorted, like something in a dream. She pulled over to the side of the road and sat there for a moment, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The bridge had been there. She knew it had been. She tried to calm herself, reminding herself that she was just tired, that she must have missed it somehow. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She decided to drive into town, hoping someone might be able to help her make sense of what she had seen. She needed to talk to someone, to hear that it wasn't all in her head. When she reached the town, she pulled into the gas station, the familiar yellow sign glowing in the dim light. A man was standing behind the counter, an old man with a weathered face and a red cap. He didn't seem to notice her car at first, but as she walked up to the door, he looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Evening," he greeted her, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "Excuse me," Laura said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just coming from the bridge," and he interrupted her, holding up a hand. "There's no bridge down that road, never has been." Laura stared at him, her mind racing. "What do you mean? There's always been a bridge down there. I've crossed it hundreds of times. Just today, The man's expression remained unchanged. "Lady, there's no bridge. Never has been. You're mistaken." Laura's chest tightened. "But I was just on it. I saw it. I crossed it. Ma'am, you must be confused. There's no bridge. You've got the wrong road." Her mouth went dry. She shook her head, but the words wouldn't leave her lips. She turned away, walking out of the gas station in a daze. The fog seemed thicker now, the air colder, as if the town itself were pressing in on her. She drove further, hoping to find someone else, anyone else who might confirm what she had seen. She passed a couple of houses, their lights dim in the fog, but as she approached them, she felt the unease grow. She rolled down her window and waved at a man standing by his mailbox, hoping for some answer, some reassurance. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice strained. "Can you tell me where the bridge is?" The man looked at her blankly, his face expressionless. "What bridge?" "The one down the road, the one I just crossed." Laura's voice was rising now, the fear and confusion bubbling up inside her. "It's gone. There was a bridge, and now it's—" He turned and walked back to his house without saying another word. Laura's heart pounded as she drove on, the realization sinking in. No one remembered the bridge. No one even acknowledged it. It was as if it had never existed at all. She had crossed it, she was sure of it. But now the world around her seemed to deny its very presence. As she continued driving, she began to question everything. Her memories, her perception of reality. What had she seen? What had she crossed? And if the bridge had never been there, then what else had she imagined? She finally turned around, heading back down the same road, hoping, praying, that when she reached the spot where the bridge should have been, it would be there. But when she reached the end of the road, there was nothing. Just empty, fog-choked space. The road stretched out before her, and Laura realized, with a cold chill running through her, that she had crossed something more than just a bridge. She had crossed into a place where her own memories no longer held any weight, and nothing, not even the familiar landmarks of her life, could be trusted. The bridge, it seemed, had led her to nowhere. And in this place, it was as if nothing, no memory, no history, not even time itself, could be relied upon. And perhaps, most unsettling of all, there was no way to return. Story number 9. The Uninvited Passenger. David had been driving for hours, the steady hum of his car the only sound in the quiet night. The road stretched before him, long and dark, the trees on either side heavy with shadows. It had been a long, tiring day, and he was eager to get home. He wasn't far now, he thought, just a few more miles. The old bridge loomed ahead, its weathered stone arches barely visible in the darkness. David had crossed it countless times before, but tonight, it felt different. The air was thicker, and the sound of the river below seemed unnaturally loud, as if it were trying to speak. He didn't think much of it, though. He was tired, and his mind was preoccupied with the mundane thoughts of work, bills, and the quiet evening that awaited him at home. As he crossed the bridge, he glanced at the rearview mirror, just a quick, automatic check like he always did. But something caught his eye. In the reflection, just behind him in the back seat, sat a woman. Her figure was faint, almost blending into the darkness, but he could see her clearly enough. She was dressed in a dark coat, her face hidden by her hair, but her presence was unmistakable. A woman sitting in the back seat, staring straight ahead. David's heart skipped a beat. He didn't remember anyone getting into the car. He was sure that the back seat had been empty when he left the house. He checked again, his eyes darting between the road and the mirror, but the woman hadn't moved. She sat there, unnervingly still, like a statue, her eyes hidden, her posture rigid. He glanced in the side mirror, hoping she had somehow just been a trick of the light, a figment of his tired mind. But no, there she was, still there, her silhouette faint but undeniable. A chill ran down his spine. He swallowed hard, trying to focus. He hadn't seen her get in. He was sure of that. Had he missed something? Maybe he had been too distracted, too lost in his thoughts. Maybe she had slipped in while he wasn't paying attention, though he couldn't recall hearing the door open. It didn't make sense. David's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he tried to shake the feeling of unease creeping over him. The woman sat silently, still as ever. No movement, no sound. But her presence. He could feel it, like a weight pressing down on him. He had to stop. He had to know what was going on. He pulled over to the side of the road, his tires scraping against the gravel as he came to a stop. His breath came out in short, quick bursts, and his hands were trembling as he slowly turned off the engine. For a moment, the silence was deafening. He sat there in the dark, alone with the sound of his own heartbeat. He slowly turned around, his eyes fixed on the back seat. But when he looked, the woman was gone. The back seat was empty, just as it had been when he first started the car. David blinked. His breath caught in his throat. He stared at the seat, his mind racing. Where had she gone? How had she disappeared so quickly? Had he imagined her? No, he couldn't have. He had seen her clearly in the mirror, sitting there, her dark presence filling the space behind him. He wasn't mistaken, but she wasn't there now. He opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, his shoes crunching on the gravel as he circled the car. He checked the back seat again just to be sure. Empty. Nothing but the faint smell of leather and the lingering scent of his own fear. His hands were shaking as he ran them over the seat, just to confirm there was no one there. Still, there was something in the air, a feeling he couldn't shake, something deep in his chest that told him she had never left. His mind swirled with confusion, as if his very sense of reality was shifting. He climbed back into the car, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror one last time. The woman wasn't there, but somehow he could feel her presence. He could feel her still watching him from somewhere just behind him, her gaze heavy and unblinking. David started the car again, the engine's roar breaking the silence of the night. He drove on, trying to shake off the feeling that lingered in his mind. But no matter how much he told himself that it had all been some strange trick, some moment of fatigue, the truth gnawed at him. The woman was still there, somehow. And as the road stretched on ahead, he couldn't escape the feeling that she had never really left. She was still with him, and she always would be. Story number 10. The Reunion. The anniversary of Peter's disappearance always brought a strange heaviness to Rachel's chest. It had been years, but the memory of that day, The day the bridge took him never faded. She had tried to move on, tried to bury the sorrow in the years that followed, but it always returned, like the tide coming in on a quiet night. No matter where she went, the bridge called to her. And this year, the call felt louder than ever. Rachel had lived in the town for most of her life, but she hadn't been back to that bridge since the day Peter disappeared. It was the kind of place that seemed to carry memories of its own. Memories that didn't belong to just the people who lived there, but to the land itself. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, always with a lingering dread in their voices. They said the bridge was cursed, that it had no mercy for those who returned to it. Rachel had always laughed off the stories. She was never one to believe in things like curses or superstition. But this year, something had shifted inside her. Something pulled her to the bridge. She needed to see it again, needed to confront the memory of her brother and the questions that had never been answered. The fog was thick as Rachel drove into town, the sky a dull gray, as though the clouds themselves were mourning. When she pulled into the town square, she didn't even have to ask for directions. The bridge was still there, standing silent and imposing at the edge of the town, its old wooden planks weathered and dark. It looked the same as she remembered, unchanged by the years, as if it had been frozen in time. As she stepped out of the car, a strange chill ran through her, the air colder than it should have been for the time of year. She hesitated, standing there for a moment, feeling the weight of her decision. She could turn around now, go back to her car, and never look at the bridge again. But she didn't. She had to know. She had to face whatever had haunted her all these years. The townspeople were watching her from their porches as she walked toward the bridge. Some of them nodded, some turned their heads, but no one said anything. They didn't need to. The look in their eyes was enough to make her feel the weight of their unspoken warnings. "Don't go near it," one woman called out from her porch, her voice shaking. "It won't let you leave, not if you're asking questions. It never lets you leave." Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. She knew what they thought. They all thought she was crazy for coming back, but she didn't care. She had made up her mind. When she reached the bridge, the fog seemed to thicken even more, swirling around her ankles, as if it were alive. The wooden planks creaked beneath her feet, and with each step the air grew colder, more suffocating. Her breath came out in visible puffs, sharp and uneven. She tried to push the fear aside, to tell herself it was just the chill of the evening, the dampness of the air. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. As she reached the middle of the bridge, the world seemed to shift. The air around her grew still, the sounds of the town fading into silence. All she could hear was the faint rush of the river below, the water flowing slowly, endlessly. And then, as if the bridge itself were listening, Rachel looked down at the reflection in the water. At first, it was nothing more than the dark, murky surface of the river, the ripples distorting the trees and sky above. But then, there was movement. A shadow, dark and indistinct, seemed to shift just beneath the water's surface. It looked like a figure, a person, though the shape was too vague to make out. Rachel's heart stopped. She leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow moved again, closer this time, rising from the water. She saw the shape of a head, then the outline of a body, and for a moment she swore she saw the face of her brother, Peter. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his expression frozen in that final moment before he disappeared. She could almost hear his voice, his laugh, as if he had never truly left. "Peter?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow seemed to respond, shifting in the water, mirroring her every movement. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the river's surface. The water was still again, the reflection now nothing more than the same dark depths. Rachel stumbled back, her legs unsteady beneath her. She turned, her pulse pounding in her ears, her eyes darting to the other side of the bridge. The fog was thick now, clinging to the air like a heavy blanket, but there was no sign of anyone, no sign of Peter, no sign of the shadow. But the chill remained, heavy and suffocating, and the bridge seemed to press in on her, its silence a weight she couldn't escape. Rachel stumbled off the bridge, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't look back, she couldn't. She drove away, the road ahead long and lonely, the townspeople's warning still echoing in her mind. But even as she left the bridge behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that Peter had never truly left, that the bridge held him in its depths, waiting for her to return. And somehow she knew it would always be waiting.